Good morning. Good to see everybody here. Want to put a plug in before I go about Saturday. This Saturday is our men's breakfast, and also after that at 10:30. Unless I got my dates wrong, yeah, it's just the third Saturday. At 10:30, we're having a Enter in Your Place workshop again, so we can talk about the upcoming activities, how we can get involved if you want to be involved more, and you want to put in ideas for how we can get more done. Please come to that. It'll be from 10:30 to about 11:30, and maybe 12, and then that's coming up this Saturday. So if you can be a part of that, that'll be really good. We've been dealing with the idea of love and how we should make decisions, make it intentional. And today we're going to be talking about loving as neighbors. What does it mean? And this is something that has been part of a debate for a long time, maybe not recently, but certainly in the time of Jesus. And in Luke chapter 10, this is where we're going to spend our time. It's the parable of the Good Samaritan, and it's probably one of the most popular parables in the entire Bible. In Luke chapter 10, though, we have Jesus being put to the test. And verses, starting in verse 25, it said, "Behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tested him, saying, 'Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?' And he said to him, 'What is written in the law? What is your reading of it?' So he answered and said, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself.' And he said to him, 'You have answered rightly. Do this, and you will live.'" So the test came when he asked Jesus, "What shall I do to inherit eternal life?" And it seems like he was hoping that Jesus would say something that he could trip him up with or make an accusation against him or something. So here's the test. And so Jesus responded with the question, "What does it say to you? What do you think?" And so he told him the answer here: to love the Lord your God and to love your neighbor as yourself. And so Jesus said to him, "All right, do this and you'll live. You said it correctly, so make sure you do it," right? Now, at this point, the man felt like he had to defend himself or to justify himself, and I'm not exactly sure why. Although it could be because maybe he felt like the test that he gave, Jesus didn't respond in the appropriate way, so he had to try to cover his tracks a little bit, or maybe make up for the fact that he's kind of lost face here because he challenged Jesus and obviously lost. Or it could simply be because he wants to know the answers to something, because now he wanted to find a way to try to trip Jesus up even more, or to make himself feel better because he could see Jesus, he could think that Jesus is making a judgment about him, that he's not loving enough, which could be very well what was happening. And Jesus told him to go and do that, and you'll live. But it says in verse 29, "But he, wanting to justify himself, said to Jesus, 'And who is my neighbor?'" All right, so that's the question that we're dealing with today, and we're talking about the idea of love and loving our neighbors. We need to deal with who is our neighbor. And it sounds like from the outset, if you look at this, and on first glance, it kind of sounds like a strange question. Who's my neighbor? If you went to anyone on the street and said, "Hey, who's your neighbor?" they could tell you who their neighbor was, right? But it's more complicated than this. It seems like it may be a knee-jerk response on his part because he's trying to justify himself. He just throws out the first thing that comes to mind. "Oh, yeah, well, I'm going to get you on this one. Who's my real neighbor?" It actually probably is more likely that he is referencing something that has been a debate for a long time in the Jewish community. And so this is part of the test and part of what he's putting to Jesus to find out what he thinks and what he says. When he quoted this verse about loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and also loving your neighbor as yourself, he was quoting Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 18, where that was verbatim. It said to love your neighbor as yourself. And so there was a lot of discussion about what that meant. In the Old Testament, the word neighbor, it meant literally someone who was a neighbor, someone who's nearby. And so this began to be expanded, of course, to the people who were not just right next door, but the community that you lived in. It was very easy for them then to see that this was the community in the area where they lived. And if you consider the fact that Joshua was told to go in and to wipe out all the Canaanites, the people theoretically who should have been alive in the area of Israel, the only ones that should have been there were the Jews, were the Israelites. They weren't called Jews at that time. So it's easy to see how that if you are an Israelite and you're living in the nation of Israel and your neighbors are all Israelites and God says to love your neighbor, it's easy how you might start to think that he meant for you to love your fellow Jew or your fellow Israelites and no one else. Because there's a covenant that's there. They have a relationship that's there. And they have a unity, a bond, and they have something that the rest of the nations don't have. In fact, that's what the difference between the Jew and the Gentile is. The Jew is someone who had, the Israelite is someone who had a covenant relationship with God that came through Abraham and through Moses and with the law of Moses. And the rest of the people in the world, they're just the nations. They don't have the same kind of relationship with God as they had. And so you could see how it would be easy to start thinking, okay, when he says to love your neighbor, he's talking about those in my proximity. Those in my proximity are the ones who are like me. And so therefore, what do we do with the people who are not my neighbor? So there's a lot of discussion that came up. In fact, we could go in and say, we can see how if Joshua was told to go in and destroy all the people of Canaan and drive them out, and God only wanted the people that were Israelites in that area, then it's easy to start thinking that, okay, these are my neighbors and everyone else, we're supposed to kill them. We're supposed to hate them. We're supposed to drive them out. We have nothing to do with them. And there are a lot of passages that deal with that idea of not having anything to do with them, not wanting to be influenced by them. They weren't even, according to Jewish tradition, they were not even allowed to go into the house of a Gentile. There were a lot of problems with the Gentiles, and the best solution for them was to completely stay away from them. That carried on for a long time. Now, what happened in a practical sense, however, is we all know that Joshua, when he went in, he did his job, but the rest of the work that was intended to get the rest of the people out of the Canaanites out, there were a lot of problems with getting them out. Sometimes it was the Canaanites just were really fierce and didn't want to leave, and the Israelites gave up. Sometimes it was the case that the Israelites didn't even try. They just said, I don't think I really want to worry about this. And so they became a thorn in the flesh of the people of Israel. And so the question comes up when we look at this, did God mean when he said to love your neighbor as yourself, did he mean to look around and see that you only have Israelites around you, so therefore you treat them with love? Or is that simply a coincidence? That's the debate. Is it simply a coincidence that an Israelite could walk out his door and almost everywhere he looked, they're all Israelites around him? And so that's just a coincidence? And that really started coming into light whenever the Assyrians took the Israelites into captivity and spread them to the four winds. And also when the Babylonians came in and took them into Babylonian captivity for 70 years, this started really becoming an issue because now they can walk out their door and their neighbors are not necessarily Israelites anymore. They may be some Israelites around, but they were spread out. And so now the question started to become, did God really mean for me to only love the Israelites, or should I be loving my neighbor? In the New Testament, the issue is not really settled because when there are, as far as I understand, there are Greek words that mean a neighbor like we think of the word, like my neighbor, somebody who lives close by. And the word for love your neighbor as yourself was also translated to be, actually the word is an adverb that means near. And so that's where it's from. And so it's related to those people who are close by. And that's where the debate started to come into full swing, especially when we have this dispersion. And it wasn't any different in the New Testament. I've always wondered why it is that in Matthew chapter 5, which we'll get to, why Jesus had to say, you have heard that it was said of old, love your enemies and love your neighbor and hate your enemies. And I remember thinking, where in the world does it ever say to hate your enemies? That's not something that the Bible said. That is something that developed over time. And it's because of the reasoning. This is part of the reasoning process that brought that to light. So that their idea of neighbor was that we're talking about fellow Jews. Of course, I'm supposed to love a fellow Israelite. We're part of the relationship with God. And so now the big debate comes. Does God want us to love the Gentiles? And there were, in Jesus' time, there were religious elite that absolutely forbade that idea. In fact, the Pharisees would have been some of them. The Sadducees would have been some of them to a degree. They did not want to mingle with the riffraff, and they certainly didn't want to mingle with Gentiles. But we also see that common people went the other direction with it. They saw the practicality of it, and evidently, in recognizing that if God says to love your neighbor, and my neighbor is a Gentile, should I show some love to that neighbor? And their answer was yes. So the Pharisees, who were actually started from a clique or a clan that was from what they called the Hasidim, and the Hasidim means the separated ones. That's the idea of where their origin story came from. They wanted to be separate from all the areas of the world, all the Gentiles. They wanted to show that distinction between the Jews and the Gentiles, and they were all for it. That's one of the reasons they had such problems with the sinners that were in the area in Jerusalem and the surrounding areas, because those sinners didn't see it that way. They would actually mingle with, at least to some degree, the Gentiles. We see examples of that in the New Testament. Especially, I'm thinking of one when we have the centurion who came to Jesus asking for help for his servant. And they came to Jesus, and the elders of the temple of the tabernacle came to Jesus and said, "Please listen to him. He's a good man. He has done many good things for us. He loves Israel." And so they were actually pleading for Jesus to help a Gentile. So you can see there, then the question would be coming up. When he asked, "Who is my neighbor?" that's a pretty loaded question. And it could be that he is asking that because he knows how loaded it is. So let's look I've already mentioned that, Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 through 44, how he says, "You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor, but hate your enemy." But then he says that we ought to love those people. We ought to treat them well. We ought to pray for them if they spitefully use us. If they hurt us, we ought to do good to them, right? And so this is part of the discussion that's come up. And so the lawyer's question was, does God want us to see Jews as neighbors or everyone as neighbors? All right, so understanding that then, here are the two sides. As I said, I want to make sure that we're clear on it. The first one is that neighbor applies only to the people in the covenant relationship with God. I actually read an article earlier this week that was arguing for this. The argument was, anytime we have a covenant relationship with people, with God, these people are our neighbors. It doesn't matter where they are or who they are. And so we treat them with love. And he says everyone else, they don't get treated the way we treat each other. Now, there is some truth to that. We know that we are to do good to all men, especially those of the household of faith, in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10. We know that we all have priority over the rest of the world. We even know that from a family perspective, that I take care of my family first before I help even anyone else out. But that doesn't mean that we never help anyone else out. And so this part of the discussion, that's part of the one side. The second side is neighbor applies to anyone that's near you. All right, so there's the two horns of the dilemma. There's the two parts that he is being asked to discuss. And so Jesus told a story. There was a man who, it says let's start reading this in verse 30. "A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, who stripped him of his clothing, wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a certain priest came down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise, a Levite, when he arrived at the place, came and looked and passed on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. So he went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and he set him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. On the next day, when he departed, he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said to him, 'Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I come again, I will repay you.' So which of these 3 do you think was neighbor to him who fell among the thieves?" And he said, "He who showed mercy to him." Then Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." The same thing he told him before, go and do likewise. In other words, he said, do this and you will live. Now he says also, do this. This is what you should be doing. So Jesus told this story, and think about how it says that we have the priest who's coming, it says coming down from Jerusalem. This is a term that meant that it says, actually, it doesn't say from Jerusalem. It says it's coming down the road. And in verse 31, a certain priest came down that road. That word down is an indicator that he's coming from Jerusalem on this road. It's actually a dangerous highway. And that means that it's possible that he had already been up there performing his priestly duties, and now he's heading home. Whatever the case is, he's coming from Jerusalem, and he comes across this man, and he just passes by. He doesn't do anything to help him. And then we also have the Levite, who also would have been considered a leader of the people, spiritually especially. And now it says he came by him and investigated, but he also passed him by. And then we have the Samaritan, who came to where he was. And when he saw him, he had compassion. Now, this is an interesting part, because I want you to notice in verse 36 the question that Jesus asked. The question he asked was, which of these three do you think was neighbor to him who fell among the thieves? Now, this is implying that Jesus thinks there's only one that was a neighbor to him. He said, which one was it? That strikes at the heart of the idea that a neighbor is someone who is in a covenant relationship. It doesn't do any good to have this covenant relationship if we don't actually act on it, if we don't treat one another with love, if we don't act out in love. The priests and the Levites were certainly fellow Jews, but Jesus didn't consider them to be neighbors because of the question, which one was a neighbor? And the only answer that could be given is the one who actually showed love, cared about him, treated him the way he needed to be treated. So it went from the first question was, who was my neighbor, to who showed himself to be a neighbor. There's a flip right there at the end. And it's a twist that should make us pause and think about, why would he say it that way? He could have easily said, who was the neighbor in this situation? But he didn't. He said, who showed himself to be a neighbor? And those are two very different questions. Now, if you look in chapter 10 and verse 34, it says he went to him. Now, this is the Samaritan. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and he set on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The word there is not used. The word near is not used. But it says he came to him. Location means he was there. He was near him. And so it's pretty obvious what is being stated here is that the one who came near him is actually the one who was near him. He is the one who came to him, not just physically came to his aid, but was near to him in the care, in the sense of being there for that person. The priest and the Levite, they were as far away from that person as they could get, both physically and on the other side of the road, and also emotionally or spiritually being as far away. They didn't want anything to do with it. You almost might even see the priest maybe even turning away and humming a tune. He doesn't want to pay any attention to this. He doesn't want to deal with this situation. The same thing with the Levite. At least it said that he looked. He kind of looked intently. He kind of trying to figure out what happened. But that, it's kind of like when you're driving down the road and somebody sees a wreck. What do you have to do if you see a wreck? You have to slow down 20 miles an hour slower and strain your neck as long as you can see, evidently, right? That's what you're supposed to do. That's the law because everyone does it. That's what he did. He craned his neck, saw what it was. I don't think I want anything to do with that. How close was that man to him? He was as far away as you could get. But a Samaritan, incidentally, you know that the Jews hated the Samaritans and the Samaritans hated the Jews. This man who saw an enemy did not treat him as an enemy. It says he had compassion. How is it that we can show love to someone? We go near them. We have compassion. Not just physically be near them, but emotionally be near them. That we have empathy. There's a difference between empathy and pity, and that it doesn't matter too much for this discussion, but we need to have some kind of a connection with that person and from a recognition of need and a recognition of our responsibility and a recognition of our ability to help. This is what it means to be a neighbor. So when Jesus said, who was it that showed himself to be a neighbor to this one who fell among the thieves? The answer is very, very obvious. It's the one who came near. So here are 7 lessons from this parable that we can take. These are going to be quick. First one is being Jews did not make them neighbors. That was pretty obvious. And let me apply this to us. Being a Christian does not mean that we're neighbors. Our relationship with God, it ought to mean that we're brothers and sisters, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. The focus should be from the other person's perspective. That's what Jesus actually did. He turned it around. The question was, who is my neighbor? And Jesus' answer was, who showed himself to be a neighbor to that other person? So if you think about it from that perspective, it takes the focus off of me. Who is it that I'm supposed to be responsible for? And then it puts it on the other person. But it then again forces you to come back to yourself again. When you see people who are in need and you have the opportunity and the ability and you're nearby them in location, you see exactly what's going on. You know that this is not fake. You know that this guy is not trying to pull one over on you. You can look around and see if there are other robbers and things that are around, and you simply have to make the decision, am I going to actually be a neighbor to this person, show this person love or not? And when I make that decision, then to that person, I'm a neighbor. So it has to do with that person's perspective about me. Am I actually presenting myself as if I were a neighbor? Instead of who is my neighbor, it's how can I be a neighbor to other people? The third lesson is our activities determine whether or not we're neighbors, right? It's our actions. This is what I love about Jesus. He's not telling us that he does this so often. He's not telling us that we have to somehow earn our salvation. This is also, I don't believe, an excuse or an opportunity for us to guilt trip each other about all the missed opportunities that we've had, although that is an important idea. This isn't something where we're going to look, the most application I heard when I was growing up about this parable was the most common illustration was you're driving down the road and you see someone broken down on the side of the road. That's not the same situation. Someone today broken down on the side of the road is not the same as someone who is beaten and left half dead on the side of the road. That's not the same thing. So we don't have to feel guilty because we make a decision to drive on. That's not the point. The point is, what opportunities are we going to take advantage of in order to be a neighbor to other people? When we look at it that way, it stops being about whether or not we should stop. It starts being about who can I influence? Who can I help? Who can I show love to? Because that means I'm getting away from outside of myself and I'm thinking about someone else for a change. And that's hard to do, isn't it? That's really hard to do because our first priority is us. But it's not really. Our first priority is God. And we all remember how the song goes when you grew up. If you grew up in the church, you probably sang it, J-O-Y, J-O-Y. This must surely mean Jesus first, yourself last, and others in between. You remember that song? Maybe you never heard of it. It's a good song to learn. I'm going to have to teach it to the pew packers. Jesus first, yourself last, and others in between. What does that mean? Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. That doesn't mean that you don't love yourself, but it does mean that we have priorities. And that's a great challenge for us because what we want to do is see the needs and say, I don't know who that person is. We want to look at that and say, I don't even know if that's my neighbor. I don't know anything about this person. He may live in Timbuktu. Why do I need to help him? Instead of that, it's, am I going to be a neighbor to this person or not? Is he going to consider me a neighbor when this is over? And it's about opportunity. Jesus spoke so many parables, honestly, about seizing opportunity because that's how we grow. And if God wants us to produce a lot of fruit, which John chapter 15 and verse 8 tells us, by this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so you shall be my disciples, then he's trying to get us to step outside of our own thinking process, our own identity of who we are and what we want to do, and move into what other people need so that we can actually produce the fruit that God is helping us to produce. If we are not actively producing fruit, we are not producing fruit. It doesn't happen by accident. So that's one of the lessons. Also, Lesson 4. Our salvation is somewhat dependent upon the nearness of other people to us. Now, what I mean by that is not that we're trying to save ourselves. God saves us. But we also know that faith without works is dead. You cannot be saved by faith that doesn't do anything. And when we act, if we do it the way God teaches us, then when we act in accordance with his will, the people that we're acting toward will see us as neighbors, or they should see us as neighbors. Now, that's not always going to be the case. Some people will react in the wrong way. There's no question about that, right? They won't want our help. They won't want anything to do with us. They want anything to do with Jesus. And so we may be persecuted, but even then it shows that you're faithful to God. Even then you're producing fruit. But our nearness to others was somewhat dependent upon. Number 5, loving others is what creates the neighbor. Who we choose to show mercy to determines who our neighbors are, not proximity and not our beliefs. We can be neighbors to everyone if we use the opportunities. Number 6, the more we reach out to others, the bigger our reach becomes. Like I said, it's about opportunity. If you think about what Jesus said in the parable of the talents, the man who had 5 talents increased it to 10, man who had 2 talents increased it to 4, man who had 1 talent, he went and hid it. And the 2 that were praised weren't praised because of the amount, they were praised because of the effort. And the effort that they put in increased. And that was, of course, what would happen naturally. And this is what we have. We have opportunity to do good. And we look at our own talents, look at our own abilities, we look at our own opportunities, and now we have the opportunity. Are we going to reach out to other people? And the more we reach out, the more we have the ability to reach out, because to one who had 5, he had 10. He had even more opportunity to do good. And the more opportunity you have, the more you can do. And the more you do, the more opportunity for more good that you have. If you think about it from that perspective, it's kind of like a chain of events. If you go out and do one thing, that puts you in a situation, a position where more than one thing may actually come from that, where you can do even more. And we can certainly, run ourselves ragged. That's not the issue. That's not the point. But we have opportunity. And the thing about the fruit of the Spirit, especially with love, there is no limit to how much we can love. The only limit that we have to how much we love is the limits that we choose to impose upon ourselves. So our choice as Christians is continue to push those limits, those boundaries of love, in the sense of growth, that we're growing outside of our own selves and we're starting to influence and affect the people who are around us. And the bigger we grow, the bigger that influence is going to be. So it's all about opportunity. And then those with the most influence are those with the largest radius of neighbors. I've met some people that I so admire that I just can't understand how they can be so influential for others around them. I'm still trying to figure it out. But I know one thing about it. It's because they have the ability, the capacity to love so much more than I do. To be able to influence, we have to be able to connect. And when we connect with other people, we do that by showing care and concern and love. They become neighbors to us, or we become neighbors to them. And then we have that influence. But it has to then, the activities that we're involved in have everything to do with that. So this is about the recipient and not the giver. Instead of who is my neighbor, change it to who sees me as a neighbor to them. It's not that we serve everyone. That's impossible. You can't serve everyone. I put this out in a text message in one of the text devos earlier this week, and I'm not running anyone down that sent this back to me, but I asked the question, who are you going to be kind to today? And the answer I got back from almost everyone that sent me a message back was everyone. I'm going to be kind to everyone. Like, you can't be kind to every single person on the earth. It's impossible. For one, you can't reach them all, right? I understand the sentiment that we're kind to all men. Sure, but what I'm trying to go for is, who is it that we are missing that we could be being kind to that we haven't even recognized or noticed yet? Why? Because it's easy to be kind to the people that are kind to us. It's easy to show love to people that we are to get along with. But what is a challenge is when we start expanding our boundaries of how we love, how much we love, and that is to include other people in that circle. It's not easy for any of us to do, but it's called growth. And we can't do that until we start noticing other people who have need that we can step in and say, hey, I think we can help with that. That's when it starts to grow. And until we start making those kinds of decisions to intentionally include other people that we might not have been including, that circle is going to remain small. And please don't take this the wrong way. Your circle may be a whole lot bigger than mine. And I say that sincerely. I'm not great at this. But I promise you, your circle is way too small. How do I know that? Because it's eternal. When we can say that love, we have enough love, we can say that I love exactly like God does. God has the capacity and the ability to not only care for, in the sense of feel about, but also to show and to act on the behalf of every single human being alive on this planet simultaneously. None of us can do that. But we can grow. We can improve more. We can influence more. And sometimes that becomes a matter of strategy. Sometimes it becomes a matter of, you know what? I'm going to turn the television off and do something. I'm going to stop doing this and start doing this because it'll be more productive. That's part of what growth is. I can't tell you how to do that. All I know is that we need to do it. So let's make sure we're trying our best to be intentional in who our neighbor is. Care, love, because that's what God did for you. I'm so happy that God did not limit his circle to the beings who deserved it. None of us would be in that circle. If you're not a Christian, I want you to know that God cares for you, he loves you, and he will do everything he can to save you. But he will not save you against your will. We have to make a decision. And if you need to be baptized this morning for the remission of your sins, if you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and you're willing to make a confession of that, and you're willing to make a change in your life to start living differently, Peter said in Acts chapter 2 and verse 38, repent and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of your sins. And God can save you, but it's a decision that we have to make. And all of us Christians have made that. If you are a Christian and maybe you need some help in this area, you need to expand your circle of love, maybe it's just simply making a decision where you are. If you need encouragement, though, if you need prayers of the church, you need prayer for sin you committed, anything like that, won't you please come as we stand and sing?